Hey, what's up? It's Josh. Welcome back to the channel. So glad that all of you are here. Today we're chatting about the Canon R3 and specifically how I set up my R3's autofocus system to best suit my needs. Now, a lot of you guys know I've been shooting on the R3 really ever since it came out. I pre-ordered the camera and got it on release day and I've been shooting with it ever since. And I really love this camera. I transitioned from the R6 and I had shot with the R5 as well to the R3 and I've really enjoyed using this camera. But one of the things that I struggled with right off the bat was adjusting to the autofocusing system on the R3. Now, honestly, this camera has arguably one of the best autofocus systems, if not the best autofocus system I've ever used in a camera, but transitioning from the R5 and R6, which I was super comfortable with, to the R3 was a little bit of a transition. So what I want to do today is just walk you guys through all the different autofocus settings and menu settings that I use on this camera to specifically set up the autofocus system for my needs, and just kind of talk to you about some of the quirks and weird things about the autofocus system on this camera. It's a fantastic system, but takes a little bit of getting used to. So hopefully what I can do in this video is just chat with you about my experience with the autofocus system on the R3 and hopefully just help you guys learn how to use it, learn how to love it, because honestly, it's one of the best focus systems, if not the best one I've ever used. So let's go ahead and dive into how I set this thing up and how to make the best of what really is a fantastic autofocusing system. All right, so right off the bat, I want to chat about a couple differences between the R5 and R6 and the R3. So in the R5 and the R6, you basically have a bunch of different autofocus modes that you can choose from, and one of those modes is to track faces. You have a little spot focus, a 1-point focus, a small zone autofocus, a large zone autofocus, the full sensor autofocus, and a tracking mode, and all of those modes are different. And so if you want to move into tracking mode, you can switch the autofocus system on the R6 or the R5 over to that tracking mode. I've talked about this in my R6 video, how I specifically set up my R6 to switch between the tracking mode and single point focus mode. Now, when I switched to the R3 actually has done something different with their autofocus system. They have tracking enabled on every single focus mode. There's not a dedicated tracking mode. And so on the R3, you still have the spot focus mode, you have the single point mode, you have the small zone, large zone, full sensor autofocus systems, but you have the ability to disable or enable tracking for every single one of those modes. And so instead of having a dedicated tracking mode, tracking is enabled everywhere, which is honestly really helpful because the tracking system on this camera and the autofocus system in this camera is amazing, but it takes a little bit of getting used to have a system where tracking is constantly enabled. So what I want to do is just walk you through all the different autofocus menus and how I set up this camera to really leverage the tracking modes that are available in every single autofocus mode. So whether you're shooting in single point or full zone focus, you have the ability to track subjects, specifically to track people, animals, or vehicles, and you have eye detection enabled or disabled. And so if you can really lean into the tracking features of this camera and set up this camera specifically to lean into those tracking features, this camera is absolutely a beast at focusing. But you have to do a few things in the autofocus menu to really leverage this tracking. And so I want to walk you through the menus and how I set this thing up. So autofocus operation, I have this set to servo almost all the time. I do have a switch where I can switch back and forth between one shot and servo, but basically I have the camera set on servo constantly. This just allows the camera to consistently focus on whatever subject I have it trying to track. And so instead of having to refocus and refocus, being able to just half press the shutter button and have the camera consistently focus is really helpful. And then for my autofocus area, I usually have this set to spot AF. So just a little single point in the middle. And I essentially use this to just put my point over someone's face and then have the camera automatically start tracking that face and then hold that face and track that face constantly. I don't typically use the zone focusing or the larger zone focusing. Every once in a while, if I'm in a larger group of people and I don't really care who it focuses on, or if I'm shooting landscapes, I might switch away from the spot focus. But typically speaking, I'm on servo and I'm on spot. From there, the next ones are pretty obvious. I have subject tracking enabled, I have subject to detect set to people, and I have my eye detection also enabled. And then at the bottom of this first menu, I have my switching track subject priority to 0 so that it intentionally focuses on the first person, that initial priority, rather than allowing the camera to switch between subjects. I just want the camera to intentionally prioritize whoever I specifically told it to focus on first and not look for other subjects to switch between. All right, so moving on to the next menu here, this is the servo autofocus settings. I have this set to case 2, and then I have my tracking sensitivity set to -1. This just allows the camera to be a little bit more locked on, even if someone else walks in front of that person, or if I move behind a lamp or a tree or something, the camera is going to consistently keep looking for that initial subject that I was focusing on. Menu 3, I don't really do a lot here. I have my one-shot autofocus release priority set to focus. Basically, this just tells the camera, if the camera can't focus and you're clicking the shutter button, wait until the camera catches focus to actually allow the shutter to click. So if the camera's not focusing, basically it won't allow me to take a photo. And so then I know something's going wrong, the camera's struggling to focus, and I can either switch to manual focus and override that, or recompose or do whatever I have to do to get the camera to actually focus. So it's just a safeguard for me. I have the priority set to focus. The preview autofocus, I have the set to disable. Basically, this just kind of turns video focusing style modes on for the photography end of the camera. And so the camera would consistently be trying to focus all the time. So even if you drop your camera down to your waist, now it's trying to focus on the grass or the ground or the floor of the building you're in. And so it just uses a lot of extra power for the camera. And so I have it set to off, and so that the camera only really focuses when I half press the shutter button. For lens drive, when autofocus impossible, I have that turned on. Basically, the camera will just keep looking for focus instead of stopping. And then I have the autofocus assist beam firing turned just to the LED, which just basically means if I have a flash that has an autofocus beam, that flash will use that beam, but the camera light, the little LED light in the camera, is not going to fire. I just think that looks weird and I don't really use it. On to menu number 4. So this is a menu that I actually do a lot with. So the first thing on this menu is to limit your autofocus areas. Now this is a fantastic tool if you don't use every single autofocus area of the camera. And so for me, I typically use the spot mode. I use the expanded autofocus area, the expanded autofocus area around, the flexi zone 1, and the whole area autofocus. I don't use the little single point mode or the 1-point mode or the flexible zone 2 or 3. And so what you can do in this menu is literally disable specific autofocus modes, so the camera won't even allow you to select those. And so when you're switching between autofocus modes, it's a lot faster to switch between those modes because you're not having to skip over modes that you don't use. The camera automatically skips them. And so I just set this up based on the zones that I typically use, set this up however you'd like it to. But for me, these are the zones that I use: the spot autofocus, expand AF area, expand AF area around, flexi zone 1, which I've customized, and then the whole area autofocus. And then the autofocus area selection control, I have this set to main dial, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about button customization on this camera. But basically this just allows me to press my multifunction button and then select my autofocus area using the dial here on the front of the camera. So if you just set that to main dial, that'll apply later when we do some button customization. And then I haven't changed anything with the joystick sensitivity, but for the orientation linked autofocus point, I do have this set to separate autofocus points, but point only. So basically this just means when your camera is set to portrait mode and you move the autofocus point to a certain spot, it will remember where that spot was when you come back to portrait mode again. And then the same thing for horizontal mode. So this is honestly helpful really in any mode that you're shooting in, to be able to remember where the focus point is rather than have the point jump around. It's a really, really convenient tool that the camera has. And so that's what I have that set to. Menu number 5 here, I have my manual focus peaking settings turned off. Now I do use this in video, but on photo mode, I don't have this turned on. I also have my focusing guide turned off. If you're a manual focus person, turn this on. It can be super helpful. And then the register people priority, I don't know why it's in this menu, but I have a whole video talking specifically about this mode. But basically this mode allows you to register specific people's faces into the autofocus system of the camera so that the camera specifically hunts for those people's faces when it's looking for autofocus. So this is a really helpful tool if you're shooting weddings or events or corporate work where you have the same people in front of the camera consistently. And so if that's you, this is a great way to do that. I will use this for weddings, register the bride and the groom's face into the camera so the camera specifically looks for those people. You can totally get around it. The camera works fantastic without it, but it can be a really helpful tool. And then the last menu here is really all about manual focus. I have my electronic full-time manual focus turned off, my lens electronic manual focus turned to one-shot enabled magnified. Basically, this means if you need to manually focus after you've autofocused the camera and you start moving that manual focus ring on the lens, it will actually magnify in to show you exactly where you're focusing, which can be helpful if you're doing landscapes or shooting a person or a subject a long distance away and you want to really verify your focus is perfect. That's what I had that set to. Focus ring rotation, I have left that, and then my RF lens manual focus ring sensitivity, left it as, I think, the default. I don't know if that link to rotation degree is the default, but that's what I have it set to. So basically what I'm trying to do here in the focus menu is set up a camera that has a very sticky, continuous autofocus. So basically I will put that spot focus over someone's face, half press my shutter button, and then the camera will lock onto that face, track that face, and specifically hold onto that face, even if obstacles come in front of the camera. So those are the settings I have set up in the menus. Now let's talk about the actual button customization on the outside of the camera, because this will totally change how you actually use the camera and the functionality of the autofocus practically. All right, so diving in now to the customize buttons menu. This is over on the little custom settings the little orange camera menu, and then submenu number 4. Diving right in, we have the shutter button set to just the moving autofocus point, meter, autofocus by eye control. I think that's just the default. Basically, when you have pressed the shutter button, it focuses. Then I mentioned this before, I have my multifunction button, which is the little button on the front of the camera, set for AF point selection. So basically now when you press the multifunction button here next to the shutter button, it brings up all of the autofocus modes, and specifically it brings up all the autofocus modes that you have enabled. So if you've gone in and turned anything off, those will be grayed out. And now, because we've changed that setting with the main dial in the previous step when we were customizing the autofocus menu, now we can press the multifunction button to bring up all those autofocus zones, and then simply rotate that main dial to switch between all the different modes. So if you want to go from spot autofocus to the whole area autofocus, you can literally press your multifunction button and click one click over on your main dial, and now you've switched between those modes. So you don't have to tap through the multifunction button or maneuver the joystick. Everything's right here just with the same index finger that you're using on your shutter button. This is a really handy tool. I set this up on every single camera that I have, and it really helps the autofocusing system work much more smoothly. So moving down, multifunction button 2, that's the top button here on the front of the camera. I have this set to eye control. So if you've used the R3 before, you know you can actually scan your eye in the camera and then literally look in the viewfinder of the camera and tell the camera where to autofocus. I unfortunately can't demo this because you can't actually record what's happening in the viewfinder, but it's a really cool feature. I honestly don't use it all that much personally. The one time I will use this mode is on the dance floor at receptions. So if someone's just going crazy on the dance floor, I can literally look over at them, and then the camera will automatically put the focus point on that person's face. And so it is really helpful for that, but otherwise I don't really use this mode. That's why I've programmed it on the front of the camera to a button that I rarely press. Moving down, I have the light button, mode button, all that kind of stuff set to normal, but my autofocus on button, this is one that is actually pretty cool. And we're gonna get back to this, but I have this set to metering and autofocus start. We'll talk about how I have this set up in a minute, but for now, that's what I have it set on. We'll talk about that in a second. Moving on, I have the little smart controller turned off. I just found personally when I'm using this camera, if my thumb slides over that little infrared button, it just throws off my focus like crazy. And so I just turned that completely off. If you don't have big thumbs or whatever and they're not getting in the way of that, feel free to use that however you'd like. But for me, I found I just turn it off and it works best for me. Moving down, I have my little AF point button, which is the far button on the right. I have that set to switch between one shot and servo mode. Like I said, I typically have the camera set to servo mode because I want to consistently focus on a moving subject. But every once in a while, I want to have the camera just focus one time and then stop. And so I have the little autofocus point selector button mapped to switch between one shot and servo. Moving down, the depth of field preview button, which is the bottom button here in the front of the camera, I have this button set to start and stop tracking. Now, I rarely use this button. Again, that's why it's the button that I programmed on the front of the camera, but every once in a while, the camera will be tracking the wrong subject, or I'll just need to stop the tracking mode completely and then restart it. And so that's just a great way to kind of stop the entire tracking system and then restart the tracking. Or if for some reason I don't have tracking enabled and I need to turn that on quickly, it's a nice way to just be able to press one button and have the tracking mode automatically start. I haven't changed the lens autofocus button. That still turns the focus on and off, but I have mapped my set button on the back of the camera to turn eye detection on and off. Every once in a while, I want to turn off eye detection for some specific reason, and so having that set button set to turn eye detection on and off is really helpful. And then the little multi-controller here, that little joystick, I have this set to direct autofocus point selection. For some reason, this comes turned off by default on all Canon cameras, really, and I don't know why it's set off by default, but this is a really handy way to very quickly move your autofocus point around with the little joystick. So I have this turned on. It will save you so much time. And then another thing that's on here too is if you press that joystick in, it will recenter your autofocus point. And so if you're on spot focus mode and your autofocus point is way off in the corner, you can just press the joystick in and it will recenter that autofocus point to the middle. All right, so that's it for all the buttons, but I'd mentioned a specific setting I use for the AF on button, so let's talk about that for a second. So one of the cool things you can do with the autofocus on button specifically, you can't do this with other buttons, and so I have this specifically mapped to my AF on button on the back. If you go into the menus here and you have all the different customizations you can do to the button, metering and autofocus start, if you click the little info, that'll bring up all the different options you have for that specific button. And so this really allows a ton of like layered control to the autofocus on button on the back. And so what I've done with this is I've effectively turned this button into a single point, one shot back button focus on my R3. And so I have the entire focusing system set up for like servo, track subject, look for people, track eyes, continuous servo focus, all that kind of stuff. And then I had the autofocus on button set to just be a single point, one shot back button focus style focusing system. And so if I need to switch from all this intelligent tracking, continuous focus operation to just a single one-shot focus, I can literally just press the AF on button and it switches all those settings over immediately. So if you open the little info detail button and customize all this, I have my autofocus start position set to my manually selected autofocus point. So again, I'm usually on a single point autofocus. And so this will just inherit whatever autofocus point I'm already using, which means I don't have to re-select a certain point. It's just going to do this on whatever point I've already selected. I had that servo autofocus characteristics turned off because my autofocus operation I have set to one shot. Again, I'm using this as a one shot back button focus mode. And so I have my servo autofocus characteristics turned off. Autofocus area, still on spot autofocus. Subject tracking is turned off. Subject to detect is turned off. Spot detection is disabled. Eye detection is disabled. And then basically what you can do with this is, now that you have this all set, if you're in full tracking mode, servo mode, track subjects, look for eyes, all that kind of stuff, and then you're just like, I want to just real quick one shot spot focus on one specific thing and then just hold that focus. Literally all you have to do is now just press your AF on button. It will switch all those modes over immediately for you and you're good to go. So this is really helpful if for some reason you're having trouble with the tracking modes. You can literally just press that AF on button. It will focus. You can press it again. It'll refocus. Press it again, refocus, and it just creates this beautiful back button focus style focusing system alongside all of your intelligent tracking systems. So basically what I've done with the autofocus system on my R3 is set it up to just be a beast of a tracking camera, specifically for people and with eye detection on. I've set up my different buttons on the back to be able to turn on and off tracking, turn on and off eye detection, switch between one shot and servo mode, switch between all my different focusing zones. I have all those intelligent features and all those mode switches right at my fingertips on the camera. And I also have a very, very simple one shot, one focus, spot focus mode available via the AF on button, very similar to what you'd use with a back button focus operation. Now, a couple quick tips on using this camera. I will say the tracking system takes a little bit of time to get used to, but it's really, really good. And so leaning into the servo focus and leaning into the face tracking, eye detection capability of the camera will absolutely change how you focus on this camera. If you can just lean into the fact that you're going to be using servo focus almost all the time, you're going to have tracking enabled almost all the time, and then if you need to switch to one shot, you have that autofocus on button where you can do that. This camera is a beast at focusing. I use the servo focus and the tracking modes for almost every single photo I take, whether that's landscapes and travel work, random personal stuff with my family, or event work, wedding work, portrait work. I'm using the servo with tracking almost constantly, and then I have the autofocus on button if I want to switch to a quick one shot single point focus mode. The other little tip that I will give you is if you go into the Q menu on the camera and you go up to your autofocus area, there's a little toggle that allows you to enable or disable the tracking window. And so if you click on that and it says disable, it'll say the tracking frame is not displayed, or you can enable the tracking frame. And so if you're ever having trouble with the camera tracking something, this is a really nice way to just disable the tracking completely. If you want to just use this camera in a single point mode, or you want to use it in just normal kind of continuous servo mode with just a single point, this is a really, really good way to turn that off. And so if you're having trouble with the camera tracking, this is a really, really helpful way to turn that off. So anyway, I hope that's a helpful look at the R3. If you have any questions about this, or if you have a different way that you've set up your camera, feel free to drop those in the comments or DM me on Instagram. I'd love to hear your setups and how you've used this camera. Honestly, I've been really, really happy with this camera. The performance has been fantastic and it's suited my needs really, really well. But I'd love to hear how you set your camera up, or if you have questions or problems or anything I said was unclear, feel free to leave that in the comments. Let me know. I'd be happy to help you out, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.